where we are right now, we're all amateurs when it comes to restoring life on Earth. We're all amateurs. Because it really is about our heart. And the fact is, regeneration is innate to every single person. Because anytime you care for somebody else, your community, your family, or something, you just stop and you take care of somebody or something. Caring is regeneration. And that is hardwired into us.
Welcome to Facing Future TV. I am your host, Raya Salter. Today, we are in conversation with Paul Hawken. Paul is an environmentalist, entrepreneur, activist, and author, and one of the environmental movement's leading voices. He is the author of several bestsellers and is joining us today to discuss his 2021 New York Times bestseller, Regeneration: Ending the Climate Crisis in One Generation. Welcome, Paul, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thank you so much.
We know that in the 60s, you were an activist in the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Also, in that time period, you went on to found one of the first natural food companies in the United States. Justice and the environment and business are a big part of your story, but I don't think that connection is necessarily obvious to everyone. Certainly, I would think not in the 60s. So would you mind sharing with us a bit of how you came to this work or this life's calling?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in one of the only three communist cities in the United States, Berkeley, Madison, and Cambridge, right? And so my father, I kind of lived at the university. My father worked there and taught there. And so I was influenced by what was happening in the South and what you were seeing on television and reading about it. It was just a WTF moment for a kid that was brought up in a very integrated environment, not integrated enough, by the way. So let's put that aside. I mean, oh my gosh, but nevertheless, it just seemed anathema and like, well, and so, yeah, I volunteered, to go down, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I was a photographer, trained as a photographer. So in the end, that's what I ended up doing. But initially I went to Selma, and it was just sort of emerging, certainly in the news. I wouldn't have known about it, but it was emerging. And by default, I became the press coordinator, which means registering members of the press, and then, and the reason for that was for their safety. We were tracking people because it was so dangerous. And so I got to then do a lot of interviews at 17. What do I know? Nothing. But nevertheless, there I was on radio and things doing interviews about what was happening in Selma. But I mean, I don't want to exalt my role whatsoever. I was a fly on the wall in the bigger sense. I mean, this was, Martin Luther King and Jesse and Ralph. And I mean, the activists, they were the people. But it's really important to know, right, that actually in Selma, the SLIC, which we call them, the Southern Conference Leadership Council, I mean, they came in later, and what was happening there was really the teenagers. They were the heroes, no question about it. And then later, I became a photographer for the Congress of Racial Equality, and in New Orleans, and which is an interesting job because I was always standing between the marchers and the people who were screaming at them and yelling, the whites, totally, and who were even throwing things and yelling epithets and, so forth. And sometimes they go after me because I was, closer to them, fair game. And so the fact that I was photographing them, they went after journalists too. I mean, that's the fact. So the culmination of all that was to go to Meridian, Mississippi, when John Doerr from the Justice Department got an injunction against the Ku Klux Klan, and they could no longer march with their hoods. They could march, but they couldn't march with their hoods on, But anyway, they were marching, and I was sent in to photograph them. It's just like, you have to be 17 and naive to take that on. Like, oh, sure, I'll go photograph the Klan without their hoods, Anyway, I ended up in a car, they threw me in a car, the Klan threw me in a car, and then the car didn't get very far, and it was stopped by another car. They pulled them off the road, and I was clutching my camera, and I don't know if I've ever had that level of fear in my life. And the car that pulled them off, and this is so interesting. And the guys that got out of the car that pulled them off were, they'd gone to high school together, and these guys were FBI. And the guys in the car were Klan. They all knew each other. And they would say, I forget whose name, but Johnny, man, I told you, you got to stop that shit. That's literally, I remember that quote. You got to stop this shit. It's like, I'm going, whoa. It was so revealing it was a culture. And these men on the other car were employed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and these people were the Klan, and who knows what they did in their day jobs,
Well, that's it. This whole story, there's so many, and it's so important because we're talking about engagement and inclusive activism. And it really, there's so much in terms of what does allyship mean, and without, in terms of what the argument of many activists, which is that structurally law enforcement and, some of the dark forces are very often deeply intertwined. And
the punchline there is simply that I'm so grateful for that experience, because I learned to see and witness and understand hate. It really gave me insight into how people come to hate. And the world is full of hate right now. And so for me, it was abstract until I was there, and being immersed in it was like, oh, I see how people get to in their ignorance, and of course it's ignorance, but in how they other the world, how they divide the world, how they separate it, how they place themselves above others. And so it's really beautiful right now for me to see the beautiful emergence of Black culture in this country, and expressed in so many different ways, and being honored and being recognized and being seen. For me, it's like, wow, okay. Those are the dark ages, 1963, 1960. It was just so dark down there. And I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist and permeate this country still. It does. But at the same time, there is a flowering, of what was there all along. It was in Black culture. It's been in Black culture for centuries, and manifesting itself in this time, in this way, with these instruments and music and tools and, media. So it's really quite extraordinary for me to see that.
I say that on so many levels, I find that touching. Being able to see a positive change in that trajectory or progress, even though things seem so dark now, and B, having that reverence or that understanding of the importance of the culture, these cultures of activism, the storytelling, the narrative, the music, everything that came from it, how important that remains today. And that, I think, is very much a big part of the message of regeneration.
Regeneration was about looking at the climate movement and acknowledging the great people and all the work that's been done and the progress. So, absolutely. But that lens doesn't really work, because there's this idea, and it was, really put forth first by Al Gore, who is an amazing human being. I'm not criticizing him, but it was like, if we get wind and solar, if we get renewable, right, and later EVs, but if we get the energy thing, if we stop combusting coal, gas, and oil, we get a hall pass to the 22nd century. And I'm going, wow, we need to do that. There's no question about it. But we are suffering. The whole earth is basically degenerating. We are destroying life on earth. And destroying life on earth doesn't just mean animals and pollinators and oceans and marine environments and grasslands. It means people. It means cultures. It means civilization. It's all going together. It's all connected. And so regeneration to me was a lens that opened it up, that had big arms, where you could see the world and the beautiful intersection and connections that we have with each other in our place and our locale and our history and our genetics, in a way that actually felt like we have a role to play in this, as opposed to, well, it's 1.5C, we have to do that. Or if we look at 2C, what do all those things mean to people, And it just disempowers people. They just think, well, how can they do it? We are they. We're all the they. So.
We are all the they. And it really thrills me. Several months ago, somebody gifted me Regeneration, and I was really very deeply moved by its beauty, and by its message of hope, and very particularly that intersectional framework. And you're right that intersectionality, again, going to Black culture, coined by Black women, is often very much ignored. And you talk about that regeneration in terms of regenerating life on Earth, maybe have just addressed some of that. And then the other piece that you talk about is the need for human engagement, engaging all of humanity on the climate crisis, that there's this double lens picture for what regeneration means. Could you expand on that a bit?
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing is, we all grew up, brought up, educated to be part of an economy that took life. It's called extraction.
Right.
And every company, every business, every service, whether we want to know it or not, that's what we do. We are taking life, transferring it into goods and services, which gives capital and concentrates capital. And that's the world we live in. Yes. And I think what's happened and what's happening is that because of the news, because of what's happening on the planet on so many levels and so forth, we can see that road, that extractive road ends. In other words, like, whoa, we're going down a road that just stops. And so regeneration is about saying, well, wait a minute, let's do a 180, let's pivot. The idea that somehow the only way we can have a GDP, that we can have jobs and we have prosperity and well-being is to destroy life on Earth, to extract. I mean, no company thinks that they're destroying life on Earth. They just do what they need to extract, to make, to manufacture, to mine, whatever. But the fact is, collectively, that's exactly what we're doing. And what regeneration is saying, you can create more life as a way to create an economy that is an economy of abundance. Okay. And and just one more thing, and that is like the idea, and right now, with all due respect, I mean, the climate movement is a privileged people's movement. They're talking to each other.
Yeah, this is exactly what, and you hit on something that I'd love to dig into a little bit, because as a climate justice activist, I'm very well aware that the traditional, I don't know, call it the leftist climate justice movement, the people of color climate justice movement, has long adhered to this framework of needing to move from extractive economies to new systems, getting at root causes, which include the racism and the other things, and gender inequality. And I'm pretty sure that some of that theory, some of that extractive moving way theory was inspired by some of the type of work that you and others did in natural capitalism. Tell me a little bit from that angle, because this is not a question I've really heard answered. How can business turn that corner to somehow prospering outside of this growth capitalism model? Like, how does one do that shift of real core causes and systems in a way that business can adapt to?
Well, business it's interesting, because some of the biggest and other businesses in the world are realizing that they're just as screwed as the planet unless they change. In other words, what you see right now is, and I've talked to them and I see it, is that there are CEOs who actually get it, going, it's an OMG kind of thing, like, whoa. They are mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles, and they have grandchildren or, family, community, and so forth. And they are, it's deep. Remember I said it's experiential. It's not an abstraction. Right. And then they find themselves in the midst, and maybe the CEO of these large, sprawling businesses, and they're going, should I leave or should I stay? Mm-hmm. If I stay, then I have a means to actually change something. Whereas if I leave, I'm leaving it in the hands of somebody who may not have that perspective. Mm-hmm. And so there's something underneath that you don't see yet, because you're still seeing, and the most venal parts of businesses being reported, the bank loans to fossil fuel companies. And I mean, I don't have to go down all the list of things you're seeing, but now whether business can change quickly enough, here's my theory. And when I wrote the College of Commerce, I said, business is destroying the world. Nobody does it better. Okay. And that was true and true now. But I also said that no institution that we know of has the management skills, the capital, or the capacity to do the opposite than business. Now, whether it will or not, that's another question. But I mean, the businesses are very, very skillful and they're very well managed in most cases, or they wouldn't be around. And so I think it's important to understand that capitalism is just a word. Okay. Nobody went to capitalism school. All right. Nobody went to, I mean, there was Marxism, but there was no capitalism, and so forth, even though he wrote Das Kapital. The point being is that economies are named in hindsight. And the thing is and I make this point, commerce is sacred. This exchange of goods and services and so forth goes back 10,000s of years. I mean, this is what people have always done. When Lewis and Clark came to the Northwest, they found the Native Americans, First Peoples, they had wampum shells. The shells are from Patagonia. Get out of here. So this is sacred, but business is different. Corporations are different than commerce.
That is fascinating. Is it fair to say, or at least what I took, or at least what I believe, so tell me, disabuse me, that a big part of this regeneration in terms of the generational shift is really a belief that we can change and that a generation can bring a new energy. Am I right? Am I onto something there in terms of a big part of this is like the hope of this is that how can we change in one generation? Because we can change.
Yeah, ending the crisis in one generation means we're going in the right direction at the right rate of speed. It doesn't mean ending it like we're going to go back to what before. No, that before was abnormal. So there's no normal to go back to. And it was extremely abnormal and getting more so. What's been misunderstood, I think, and the climate movement has been about privileged people putting in heat pumps and solar panels on their roofs, and that's good. That's fine. We love it. But remember what I said earlier about this is about, is about, future existential threat. That was the hallmark of the early science, which is basically threat produces fear. And activists took that up in the 70s, and that produced basically blame, shame, and guilt. So fear, threat, blame, shame, guilt stir well. And you have basically people saying, I'm out of here. I can't handle that. Yeah. And what I think, vastly misunderstand is that the only way the climate movement or this restoration, regeneration is going to work is if we pay attention to current human needs. The vast majority of people in the world wake up every single morning, mothers, fathers, sisters, daughters, sons, uncles, aunts, whatever, whoever. They wake up thinking about that threat, that day, and what they can do about food security, about safety itself, about warmth, about clothing, about housing, that's what most of the world is concerned about every single day. So unless there is this shift and understanding that the solutions that are in regeneration and my previous book, Drawdown, they benefit everybody. In other words, there's no downside to regeneration. There's no downside to restoring life on Earth. And life on Earth means, again, our children, our people, girls, women, animals, waterways, rivers, purity, air, no Flint, Michigans, what the hell going on,
Say that when people say it's like almost a slight pet peeve, of course, we are thinking of future generations. And of course, we are doing this for our children, our grandchildren. Yeah. But it's not just about, this future or going to Mars, et cetera. It's about exactly taking care of everybody.
Yeah, that everybody is here because, first of all, there is no poor people. There's only people living in impoverished conditions.
Right.
And as I say in the book, if you want to understand poverty, go upstream and seeing who's benefiting.
Yes. And in the book, well, just getting back to this, the framework, because I found it so fascinating. You've got 6 different pieces: equity, reduce, protect, sequester, influence, and support. We aren't going to be able to get to talk about all of them, but why is this in particular, this interconnected narrative framework so important? Or why have you emphasized that so much in regeneration?
There's lots of doors in, put it that way, lots of entryways and so forth. Even in Protect, for example, Protect was seen as like, the Nature Conservancy buying a big, ranch land in Mexico and fencing it in and saying, okay, we're protecting the land. And then, which by the way, didn't work. The land degraded, and they found that out and they realized they had to take the fences down and let the wild animals go. But also what they did is they didn't realize they were buying traditional lands, of indigenous people, and the understandings of how those lands should be managed, frankly, were lost or ignored, by, this Protect. Protect to me is different. Okay. What it means is that what we know is that when we protect a marine MPA, protected area, when we protect an ancient forest or any forest, when we protect the grassland, when we protect wetlands and so forth, they do 2 things. One is they actually, sequester carbon. The most effective way we can restore life on Earth is to stop, harming it. But when you protect, like there's 5,000 indigenous cultures in this, this is the diaspora from Africa, that spread all over the world and so forth. And these cultures are 5, 10, 15, 20, 50,000 years old. And the reason they're here today is because they know where they live. And that's why 80% of the biodiversity is in the lands that are owned or traditionally owned by indigenous people. So we have amazing science and so forth, no question about it. But the fact is that what these cultures have, and I include African Americans because they were kidnapped indigenous people. All right, let's be clear about this.
Thank you.
Enslaved. They were they're African American and there's indigenous people. Well, no, wait a minute. And the thing is about indigeneity is it's based on observational science. It's a science of place. And what indigenous people know, because they live there for a long time, is that nothing in nature repeats ever. And what empirical Western enlightened science is, if you can't repeat the experiment, it's not true.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a completely different way of seeing the world. And there's good things that come out of both, of course. I'm not trying to diss Western science and in favor of observational science, but observational science is so relevant and important right now. And it's coming to the fore again, although many of the elders and the wisdom holders, have basically, succumbed in genocide and the way indigenous people were treated worldwide, but nevertheless, it somehow, I don't know how, for 500 years, those traditions and ways, there's First Peoples in Nova Scotia and so forth, beautiful, beautiful tribe culture. And when they see a mother tree, a big tree in the forest and so forth, they can stop and listen to the sound of the wind soughing through the branches. And from that sound, they name the tree. They can have a language that names the sound of wind going through a tree. Mm-hmm. And they never forget the sound. It's not written down. They know the sound. Everybody knows the name of that tree. They can go back 5, 10 years later and listen to the sound and know if the tree has been damaged or it's healthy. So, that's just one small example. I can give many, many examples and so forth. So we in the West have basically been blinded to this extraordinary understanding and knowledge that was right there. And now that the earth is dying, literally, thank goodness that people are starting to turn back to people who actually, whether it's Ashwar, or, there's, like I say, 5,000 cultures, but that have this deep underlying wisdom that's been carried forth for thousands and thousands of years.
There's something to me extremely inspiring, again, similarly to the earlier conversation where we talked about, as difficult as things are now, this idea of movement and hope in terms of Black culture and experience then, Black culture and experience now. And without it, similarly in this discussion of indigeneity, without dismissing, the destruction and uplifting the resilience, still saying thank goodness we are starting to turn again to that. As much as I think a lot of folks, a lot of Indigenous practitioners and others were saying, nobody is, we're in a time of crisis. But you see a shift, a broadening of the conversation in that direction. And actually, I think that's correct in some ways. The IPCC sixth assessment in February was really one of the first times that you saw, that insertion of the need for indigenous stewardship as a climate solution really codified by the IPCC.
Right. And it's more than stewardship now. There's a lot more there, which is wisdom. Mm-hmm. And that applies to anybody everywhere. And as opposed to, oh, you're good stewards of, the headwaters in Peru. Okay, great. Of the Amazon. For sure, but there's a deeper understanding there too, which you can see in indigenous language and indigeneity is that they don't other nature. They don't other. And see, the climate movement is an othering movement, whether it knows it or not, because it's saying, oh, we want to fight, tackle, combat climate change. I'm going, really? That's interesting. First of all, you can't find climate. It doesn't exist. It's a dynamic. So good luck on that one. Second, you're othering it as if it was different, separate. And that othering is the cause of global warming. Okay. And we see it. I mean, I was in an audience that said, how many women here have never been othered? Raise your hand. Nobody raised their hand. And so, but it's not just Me Too, but it's racism, Islamophobia, it's anti-Semitism. It goes on and on and on. We are just riven ourselves by this divisiveness because we see it and it's painful. That's what I mean by riven. And so again, what I see is that we're being homeschooled by mom, the earth. She's homeschooling us. This is feedback. And feedback is a blessing. It's not a curse, and it's actually like an invitation. It's an offering to learn, to change, to transform, to make reflection within oneself.
And I keep again hearing as a thread through our conversation, this renaissance. What is this light? There's a light for you. There's this progress. There's something good that's happening. Is it because it's happening in our world now? Is it because it's always been, in us to happen? What is this thing is happening? And is it going to happen for us now?
It's because humanity is really beautiful and it's brilliant and it's amazing. It really, I'm, whatever pronoun you want to use, but humanity is extraordinary. And we can easily lose sight of that and think otherwise, by what comes at us on a daily basis and so forth. But the fact is, and I saw that again in the civil rights movement. I'm not talking about the leaders, the ones who are at the head of the march and who are so eloquent. My gosh, I'm talking about, when I'm in Bogalusa, and the only safe place I could stay, as a civil rights worker, as a photographer, is in the Black community. I was safe in the Black community. And, but I stayed with couples and families and so forth all over Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana. They're the most beautiful people. You go, my God, how can somebody be so amazingly beautiful and be subject to so much to racism and all the way it manifests itself in those cultures?
My grandparents were from rural Alabama, and
there you go.
What you're talking about, and
hundreds of years, and there they are. There's this light. And so if you have that experience, and everybody has it with somebody in some place at some time, we all do, I'm not special. And that is, go to the light, the light is there and it's in everybody. It's in everybody. I absolutely believe that.
And we're going to let it shine. It's the activist has to take that hope and that inspiration from that beauty. Let me ask you then, how do we build a truly inclusive, less elitist movement? I know that in climate environmental justice circles, we talk about, the people being closest to the pain, needing to be closest to the power. We need to invest more leadership in people of color movements and communities and do more, interracial, intergenerational organizing, et cetera. But I don't know, it's a lot to say, but how do we get to build these more inclusive movements that engage all of humanity?
There's a beautiful thing. I was writing about insects, okay, insects, pollinators, because they're the bottom of the food chain, and we lose them, the whole thing goes. Within 2 years. We go back 1 billion years. The Earth, just farmlands, everything goes. Animals, birds, and the whole thing goes. We depend on insects, and the populations are just plunging. And I was reading about this society in Germany, the Crefeld Society. They've been studying insects for 117 years, and just catching them and tagging them and measuring how many in the air at certain times of the year and all this sort of stuff, And in 2017, a scientist went there and looked at their data and realized what they were saying, which is the insect populations in this part of Rhine-Westphalia had declined by 40 to 80% in just 30 years. And then he wrote about their science and said, okay, it's insect apocalypse. And then scientists all over the world said, God, we had the same data. We didn't say anything about it. And it's worldwide. Okay. What the point about this is they were amateurs. These are amateur scientists, right? For 117 years. And what does amateur mean? Amateur means the one who loves. Amateur, it's French. And I think the where we are right now, we're all amateurs when it comes to restoring life on Earth. We're all amateurs. Because it really is about our heart. And the fact is, regeneration is innate to every single person. Because anytime you care for somebody else, your community, your family, your dog, your garden, or something, you just stop and you take care of somebody or something. Caring is regeneration. And that is hardwired into us. And so I don't know how to answer your question as to the specifics in terms of, building a movement, but it's like we're all making this up as we go along. Nobody's ever been here before. Nobody's been in this kind of situation. There are no teachers in that sense and so forth. But we do have to recognize that the core and basis of our effectiveness is going to be falling in love with each other in this place we live. And that is what is going to teach us what to do and how to do it.
Well, Paul Hawken, thank you so very much for talking with us today, talking about your incredible books and sharing some of your love and your care and your spirit.